I'm not in charge of the table. He's in charge. Yes. Oh,
Getting echo.
I did. Very nice. Oh, I wasn't over that in a while ago. Yeah.
Well, don't leave Betty alone over here now.
Which is why you're mad. I know. What do you mean? Typical. Probably be. No. I don't know. So many,
It is, it's totally. I'm glad you didn't. I really prefer. I definitely prefer it if we're in the room together. I think it's just better for us in general.
Doing it double.
Perfect. Okay. Well, greetings to everybody. Please be sure that you're aware that there's cake in the back, and we have coffee and water as well. First of all, it's great to see everybody. Great to have you here. We don't have anyone online yet. I decided to go ahead and record this week because there were a couple of people that wanted access to it, and I tried to set up the video, and then so we're just going to put it on YouTube, hopefully, to make it as accessible as possible for folks, because some folks are traveling and that kind of thing. So anyway, let me say a quick prayer, and then we'll kind of jump in tonight. We have a full docket, as you already know. Just pray. Lord, we thank you for this day, for the sunshine. The weather reminds us that there are good times in our lives. Times when the sun feels good and the breeze feels good. And in those days and times, may we take advantage of that and live to the fullest to serve our neighbors, love our neighbors, and to serve you. Can you ask and pray, Lord, that you're here with us tonight as we continue through our book study and as we fellowship with one another. In Jesus' name. Okay, well, I am Christian. I think I know almost everyone in the room, and everyone in the room probably knows me. Teaching minister here. It turns out my partner double booked again. And so Sarah will be back for the final session. So she says. She promises. No. It's okay. This whole thing was my idea anyway, so you know, can't really complain. Second thing I do want to tell you is, we decided to elongate a little bit tonight. We're gonna go up to around 8:30-ish. You can certainly leave if you need to go. I've already been told there's a couple folks that have to go. It is interesting, no matter how many times I tell you you're not Lutherans, you still sit in the back of the room. But I would just be doing my best to come forward. The second thing I did want to let you know, just brass tacks wise, is I did get email confirmation that the author will be joining us for the final session. I think what I suggested to him was he comes on for the last hour and just fields our questions and talks with us. I listened to an interview with him that he did with a different colleague, and it was basically this colleague, and they were doing a class on Romans I think it's a graduate level, maybe, or undergraduate. And basically the students talked with him, and it was just marvelous. It was a very interactive guy, very accessible. I think he's excited about the idea that folks in churches are reading his work, and he would love to be able to interact with you. So as you think about questions or things that you wonder about, things that are clarifications or whatever, bring that on that last night. And I think we'll hopefully have a great time with Michael Gorman. Okay, so we are together. We all know we've been reading through. I'm hoping you've been able to make it through reading Revelation responsibly. Last time we got together, we talked through basically the preface, introduction, and the first 3 chapters. And we kind of framed, I framed why we're doing what we're doing during that session, having to do, first of all, just with the, accident of history element, which was we had been doing disciple. We ended with the book of Revelation. Sometimes one of the weaknesses of the disciple program is you don't get a lot of time to process or enough time to process. And so Revelation generated a lot of conversation, and it seemed like this was a great, accessible book to consider, maybe an alternative way of reading the book of Revelation than what many of us might be used to or have been exposed to. So we have spent our time together on that. We did some sharing about our own experiences, etc. And then we jumped into the chapter. So what I wanted to do this week as we open is I want to give you some time initially here, probably about 7 minutes or so. And I have tried to precisely mark out the minutes because I'm notorious for going over. So 7 minutes. And I have 3 questions for you to consider at your table. So maybe we'll have one person write these down. So number 1, what has been your overall experience of reading the book thus far? Some of you, I'll get emails or text messages, or I'll see you at church, and there are different experiences. So what's been the experiences? Have they been good, not good, whatever the case, intriguing, etc. Number 2, what are some key questions, or I don't know if they're they don't even have to be coherent questions, but what are some things that are kind of sticking with you so far? You're like, I really want to know more about that. I'm kind of, a little confused about this, or boy, I hadn't heard it said that way, and it's really stuck with me. That kind of thing. So, what has stuck with you? What are some key questions that you might have now at this point? We're about 2/3 of the way through. And then, is there anything that's lingering? I know we have a couple folks who are joining us this week who weren't able to be with us last time. So is there anything lingering from those first 3 chapters, that you just wanted to register? All right. So those will take about, like I said, 7 minutes or so, and then we'll come back, share, and then I'll kind of introduce you to sort of the basic way we're going to engage, which is pretty much like we did last time. All right, chapter by chapter.
Yeah. I know.
I don't have any. I was not. It was all about justice. Yeah. Great.
do people every 2 hours. Given that we all think that is the illustration of God's justice. I don't know how to understand. But that really sort of mentioned. Book does get wrong.
Like that, page 34, I don't have the concept too. I got reading it, it's also Revelation, it's also criminal justice is similar to those in Rome throughout history to the present. It's like empire and how revolution against empire. I just remember Revelation today, and I wanted so enthusiastic for the role. Yeah, but I'm just saying that's the way it is. My other question though is.
About 2 more minutes.
There's the middle of it, it says worship is so important to Revelation, because John recognizes the worship. But elsewhere, he also said, relation to prayer. So it's putting in my mind, how does that affect how we worship the last chapter that we're music? How does that affect? I have to watch. Just the whole idea of church and how we relate.
Okay, I'm gonna invite you back.
That was not 3 minutes.
That was two. And it was actually 8 minutes instead of 7. I'm so bad. I can't help but get extra minutes.
Cheryl had the answers.
Oh, sure, go ahead. You need to tell them the answers.
I'm gonna hold you in suspense till the end of the.
Oh.
We're gonna hold it in prayer. So I gave you kind of 3 questions. I don't know if you're able to get to all of them. But what were some things that you shared at your table? What's been the experience so far? Things that are lingering from the earlier chapters, or what's maybe stuck with you? And I'm going to bring the mic to you so that they can hear us online.
My experience so far is that there's so much information in this book. And I guess my feeling almost is I need to read it 3 or 4 times to be able to comprehend and hopefully get the picture.
I think that echoes several experiences in the room. And I would say my own personally is I've been through this type of reading now probably 4 or 5 times. And now I'm like, okay, I'm totally conversant, but it takes a little while to like really, and I still don't know what to do with all the details, which is okay. I think that's part of the strategy, the reading strategy I think that it offers is that we don't have to get bogged down too much in the details. And some of the other approaches maybe overemphasize that. Who do you want to?
Well, I like in chapter 7, where he suggested to look at a play, to read it through with a list of characters and descriptions, because it makes more sense to read it through. So often we chop it in segments, but put
I was just gonna say, like, and in fact, I have it in my notes tonight, that it's like, it's a very opportune moment to stop the book and do that. As opposed to waiting to the end or doing it at the beginning and you might forget, you know, you're kind of knee deep in the middle of some of the details of the chapters and then kind of pauses for a second. I think that's a useful pedagogical strategy, actually. What about from our other tables? Thoughts over here? Oh, Lisa's always got some thoughts. Man.
I do, but I'll be brief. On page 34, I was struck by the sentence, worship is so important in the book of Revelation, because John rightly understood that worship is a political act. But first of all, the recurring theme that I keep seeing is worship, and then this week learning about the throne and the Lamb, but it hasn't affected me in a way that's affecting my worship. So that's my ongoing question is, what do we do with worship? But also I see, yeah, maybe politics is a piece of it all. And I've been enjoying the how he talks about against empire, which I think is very relevant.
Yes. There's several notations in my book that have not only yeses, but also names. Like, oh, that reminds me of that person. About over here, the comments over here.
We had 3 different opinions of the book. Mine, unfortunately, is I find the book rather burdensome. I'm the kind of guy that says, get to the point. You know, there's just so much going on. Part of the problem is too that I joined the class so late, and just recently got the book, so I've been trying to play a little bit of catch up.
Potato, I don't want it. I love the book. It really pushes me intellectually. I look at this book and I have to read a couple of the sentences 2 or 3 times. And I get to the questions at the end and I'm like, I don't even know what that means, you know, to answer. So a lot of divine intervention, that whatever I'm supposed to be getting out of this, Lord, send it to me. So big picture, a lot of things that I can actually grasp and use. And my big thing is God will apply to my life. Now, it's got to be something I can use as a tool and work with as my everyday Christian life. So I'm looking for that kind of stuff.
I was saying that I really appreciate the book a lot, and I just basically was a theme and sort of wanted, and this is just taking me so much. And I see the richness and the variety of themes about his way of dividing brings and lands within me. So, and I'm particularly interested in the political things because it's like. And also the incorrect.
Right. So religion
Yeah. So
and Christian, we're talking about it nowadays, and Christian nationalism. Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. So let's move ourselves then. Pretty much what we did last time was I kind of frame up a chapter and then I would point you basically to some of the questions at the back, and those would become the fodder for your group discussion. And my goal in framing the chapter is not to give an exhaustive analysis, but hopefully to explain a couple of things in sort of broad brush terms. Because I agree that there are, especially if this is not something that you're used to kind of reading, there can be places where it feels like you get bogged down. So I hope that this is helpful. I think of all the chapters that we read tonight, probably the hardest one was chapter 4. I would assume, because it's still sort of dealing with high level theory. You know, you're obviously he has certain examples that are going on in the book. And so this chapter deals with a field of study called hermeneutics, which is basically how do we interpret things. So a hermeneutic or a hermeneut is an interpretive theory or framework that someone has. All of us have interpretive frameworks. We are just not always conscious of the things that have gone into shaping our interpretive framework. So he talks a little bit about what hermeneutics is. In a sense, that chapter starts out, I think, with a little helpful discussion. It almost kind of flows out of, I think, the chapter before, where he's kind of talking a little bit about sort of the author and the date, and now he's going to talk about canonization. And it is sort of an interesting fact to hear that this was one of the most highly disputed texts, as the early church was kind of having a conversation about which texts are going to be authoritative in the life of the community. Not which texts are true, that's not the question, or which texts can people read, that's also not the question, but which texts are going to be authoritative for the life of the community. That's really what the question of canonization deals with. And he doesn't go into a great amount of depth. The only thing I can kind of throw out in addition to what he talks about is by the time you get to the 4th century, there's a church historian, his name is Eusebius. And just so you know, canonization, which is sort of the process of deciding what's going to be in our New Testament and Old Testament, that's not like a bunch of white dudes went in a room and made a decision. Usually that's the way it's kind of put forward, is like old people got into a room and made a decision. That's not what happened. It actually happens over the course of 200 to 300 years. And it's especially through use and letter exchanges that are going on between bishops and other folks. So these people are arguing about and talking about, these are texts that we use in our community, we find them profitable. And over time, they develop a series of criteria that determine these should be authoritative, not just for my local community, but for the whole of the kind of Christian community, wherever it might be located. By the time you get to Eusebius, not only do you have the 4 criteria, you also have sort of 4 categories. And so you have the first category is the simplest, it's the undisputed category, right? So that means these are books that everybody agrees on. You know, we engage these, they meet all the criteria, et cetera. It's pretty much settled. And it's kind of typical what you would think is the 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, letters of Paul, the book of Hebrews, a couple of First Peter, I think, is another one. And then there's a second category. So there's undisputed, and there's, I think it's called kind of disputed. And these are texts that are being used in some communities and not being used in others. And so there's no settled opinion. Then there's a third category of like books that really, maybe they should be really on the edge. Like there's a sharp disagreement. And that's where also the book of Revelation shows up. So it shows up actually in category 2 and in category 3. Category 4 is basically stay away from these, it's toxic. Like don't read these. So there's this, there's this interesting kind of debate that's going on. I know the only other piece is that there were other candidates, other apocalyptic texts that were being debated about whether they should actually be an apocalyptic text that's in the New Testament. And the one that I'm most familiar with is the Gospel of Peter, or not the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, which is also an apocalyptic text. It's probably produced in the 2nd century, but I think no matter how we feel about Revelation, if you go and read the Apocalypse of Peter, you'll be happy we didn't choose that one. Because in that one, you get very gruesome details of what happens to people, how they're punished. And it almost sounds Dante-esque. Like, you were a liar, so you're going to hang by your tongue for 1,000 years, that kind of thing. So thankfully, that did not make it into the canon, because I can only imagine the social ramifications of that, something like that being in our sacred texts. So whatever we think about Revelation, it's helpful, I think, to know that there were other options and that this one might be the least worst option. And then he offers to us different ways of reading the text. So then he really jumps into hermeneutics. And there are just 3-4 things here to kind of highlight. One is, I think, a big, broad brush that he wants to make an argument for is that there are ways of reading the book that are kind of correspondence, interpretive strategies, and then there are other ways of reading that are more analogy. So what does he mean? By correspondence, he means when you read the book of Revelation and you're trying to decode what's going on in there, and everyone has to do some level of that decoding, you're looking for precise correspondences, either in the text or outside of the text. So this is the kind of thing where it's like, oh, the beast, or, it is Barack Obama, or, like that kind of thing. So it's like a precise argument that this person, is this thing, fulfilling this prophecy, etc. The other option, which is the one that he is going to go with, is the analogy option. And basically the idea here is that all of these images and scenes are not to be read literally, they're to be read metaphorically, but what they teach us are bigger truths about God and God's ways. So the truth, of course, of the whole discussion about, the beast and the whore of Babylon, etc., is that empire is fundamentally dehumanizing. And God stands against that. And part of the call of the church is also to stand against that, but not to do so in a violent way, in a way that mimics the ways of empire. That's a big analogy approach, which is very different than the locusts must be attack helicopters approach, which is one that you will also find. He breaks that down into what he describes as 5 strategies. So that's the really big, I think to me that's a super helpful because it's just 2, options that you're dealing with. He talks about a predictive approach, which would clearly kind of, I think, especially work with the correspondence approach. The second one's called the Preterist. And this is like actually the one that Martin Luther held to, which is everything that the book of Revelation talks about happened in the past. Everything that it's describing, all the correspondences, all the prophecies that they were fulfilled in the past. Right? So that's the Preterist. They chose that name, that word, because I think it has a Latin root for past. So it's not a common word that you're going to hear. And also, yes, if you need a dictionary when you read this book, it's fine. Trust me, it's good. There's no shame in that. And then you get the theopoetic, which is the metaphor element that I think especially connects to the worship question. The theopolitical approach, which has to do with sort of the resistance literature aspect that the book of Revelation is produced in some ways by a community that is under duress and is trying to find ways to galvanize itself to resist both persecution and the temptation to assimilate. And then lastly, the pastoral prophetic, right? That this is not just about standing, over against them outside. There's also a certain sense of like comfort that needs to be conveyed, a sense of safety, security, et cetera, that God really still is in the midst of the community, et cetera, et cetera. So those 5 are developed. Then you get this really interesting section in the middle of the chapter where he talks about his problem with the left behind approach. And he talks about the reason why he critiques that is because it's so dominant. And that was actually one of the things that I was also drawn to, is that it is a very dominant, and I would suggest pernicious way of reading it, but it's out there. And he goes after the biblical, spiritual, ethical, etc. So you can kind of take that up. Just hold your questions. And then lastly, he gives a sketch of what he describes as a kind of theology of Revelation. And you can find this in 2 different places. Excuse me. One is a 7 options in pages 75 to 76. And then the other is a 5-fold set of themes that you can find on pages 78 to 79. So I think probably the last one, 78 to 79, is really the one that he would probably want to push. So that is his alternative, number one. And number two, I think maybe a word on why does that appear in the chapter is probably in order, and maybe he would probably have to answer this for sure, but my assumption is that all of us oftentimes when we come to a text, especially a scriptural text, we have a story in our mind, right? We've already heard something probably. And more than likely, if you lived your life in the church, it's probably pretty developed, right? And that story is like, it's a narrative arc, right? It typically starts from creation and goes to the end with Jesus somewhere in the middle, something like that, right? And oftentimes when we tell these stories, we can, or when we have this kind of narrative arc, we can take that narrative arc and it will help us place whatever it is we're reading in the story, right? It helps us to make sense. Where does it fit in terms of the character of God that maybe our understanding of the Bible seems to have unlocked, or what we think maybe about the end, etc. And I think he's kind of showing, in a sense, like a responsible approach to this. You don't have to agree with him. Obviously, I know there's going to be objections to that. But all of us, again, are operating with what I would call basically a rule of faith. That's pretty much what it is. It's a rule of faith. It's like a confession of faith. So he's telling you this is what he thinks the theology of Revelation is. And here it is in a coherent fashion. And even though we might read the book, and it may not always mash out every single detail, he can pretty much make sense of the big points. And so I think that's really what the function of that material there is. Okay. All right, let me stop. We're going to go into group discussion. And then you want to come back out and ask your question? Or do you want to ask your question before I send this into group discussion?
Oh, well, I was actually going to make
Okay, let me.
I've read the whole series of the song
That's fine.
Left Behind. And I think that one of the positive things of that is that there were probably a number of people who went to the Bible and actually read Revelation in the best of all worlds. That's what they have done. It got people thinking and talking about it. So, I mean, it generated discussions. And yes, he's very critical of it. But, you know, if it stimulated people to really start thinking about it and reading, that would be a good outcome. Pollyanna.
I really appreciate that. However, I'll just say, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So that would be my, yes, that is true. But, okay, so let's break up then into our groups, or I guess you're already at your groups. And on page 80 of your book, there are 4 questions. And I'd like to ask you to work your way through those questions as best you can. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes. So do your best. If you can't get through all of them, that's okay. Looks like Dave, you're on there by yourself.
Yeah.
Are you okay to ponder?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good to have you, Dave.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll see you guys in about 15 minutes or so. Hey, Dave. I just put something in the chat for you.
Okay.
Just have to be this class.
You actually start with question. Page 67, 68, 68. 6 and 67. And I'm also reading at the same time Peterson's book. And the quote in there on page 67. So that's, you know, the poet, the most wonder. So I really like that one, but then I really special really fit the approach to the pastoral.
Security, knowledge, there's control. So I don't know, belief, security about.
Revelation is a newer and more simple-minded people. And he knew there were simple-minded people and understand all. Let kind of all doesn't understand the Lord.
Yes, because I was in that one.
I mean, it was just, you know, we did the meeting. And all of a sudden, all of a sudden, they put my way it was laid out. And that's some things that we use in like what happens to the Jews. how they get one day and they're out the next. So yeah, I don't know that I didn't think it was an exception. This was the intellectual. This is a way to sort out messes. But I think I
Here's
just.
something like dispensation, this age, this period, this. I had anti-dispensation, so now whenever I read that word, I'm like, oh, that's not what I was.
So are you kicking me off? Are
Pardon?
you kicking me off the island?
Yeah. I'm like, that's-
It just raised a lot of questions. Even reverse, make up. Like, what is their stance on war?
I was a bit late before I stepped off this, so. That's why we did the first meeting, because even on the Zoom, they were like 2 to 7 a.m.
Is that the same terms as,
Yeah.
It's like, this is what all the cool kids on the island had.
I've attended it for the 2 months, 3 months ago.
Yeah, they did a whole year.
Now that I've read this book, it's kind of like.
Where's the meat? The BSF.
What's over likely?
Now that I read this book, I went back. So I wanted to talk about. So
We don't often show you different perspectives on it. Something hard, something, it's just endless.
Where the Roman, the Majestic.
No, I didn't.
About 2 or so minutes.
is the chair of the which I think was presented their church, the early churches that they have. Four, fifth, and sixth century. But then it becomes summary. Our history teacher. Right, it's not the, it's like the several house churches. Oh, I'm talking about it.
Right, I said, I think that approves it.
Yeah.
I think there's
Yeah. His mom and his sister.
I think it's a lot of.
Say was, it's a future of hope.
It is a
Most of us, one way or another,
Yeah, it's so right?
Okay, let's kind of draw back together and share some of the conversation at your table. So you got these questions on page 80. Approaches to Revelation discussed in the chapter that were attractive. Two questions on the left behind material we talked about. And what did you think about his sort of his theological vision, the one that he kind of gave? So those are kind of the questions. I hope that you were able to engage the questions, but ultimately what brings me warm heart is to hear you talking to each other and to know that you're not talking about the twins. You're actually talking about the book. So, not that you can't talk about the twins, you can certainly do that, but so what were some things that came up? Sound like you had some good, generated some good conversations.
The way Revelation is presented in this book is themes, worship, and
Swallow the line. Themes, worship, things like that, of the triumph of, even though there's the bloody part, but there's the triumph of God. And some of these other dispensationalists are left behind. None of us had really much knowledge beyond the first chapter of some of those left behind books, but it seemed that from what I understand, talking to family members, it's pretty literal. And that, yeah, if you can believe this literal stuff, then you don't really have to think about it much more, and it's much more focused on those who are not ultimately called into God. That's the focus. Whereas this book would say the focus is the triumph of the kingdom.
Yeah, I feel like did some of you say that the people that you wind up attaching yourself to are the people who get left behind?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Right. Oh, I think so. I didn't read them. But they're the ones that you care about. And so that's, anyway, I mean, it is a great yarn on a certain level, but then on the other side, like the actual message that you hear here is that it might have something to say to church in general. In a way that's different. Is that kind of weird? Yeah. Other thoughts, other comments? Lisa? Cheryl?
So we kind of got off on, well, acknowledged that we hadn't really gotten the Left Behind series, but for me, I think you missed the point if you think it's going to tell you when this is going to happen, or this is what happened, or here's where you can go, because along this civil religion argument, it puts one more thing between you and God. It takes the wonder of God and walking with God and having a relationship with God and worshiping God. If you're going to take the literal thing, like some people know more about that, like the literal, this is what's going to happen, or this is what did happen, however you look at it, whether it's behind or forward or right now, you're missing the whole point of walking with God and worshiping the Lamb.
Amen. Other comments? Okay. Jen?
But I have a question about one phrase in there.
There was a comment on one of the pages, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me.
It's right here.
Page 79. Tell me where to go. And the question I had, what is God's new heaven? And yeah, but mostly what is God's new heaven versus the old heaven? Or is that our interpretation of what was there and what's coming?
So I'll defer that to Michael. Mr. Gorman, not because I don't have my own thoughts on that. I don't know what he would say. I mean, my thoughts is that the heavens and the earth, these are linguistic terms that simply fit together to talk about the whole. And that heaven is the space or place that God never surrendered in the fall of creation, because heaven itself is created. And so in the heavens is where God's throne is, in the heavens is where God's will is done, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the bringing of the kingdom of heaven is the bringing of a world and realm where God was never displaced, is sort of the way that would be how I would unpack that. And so that use of that language of a new heaven and a new earth, it's not so much about the sky, though I suppose it might be, I don't know. But that's not what I think it's really after. What it's really after, I think, is sort of this broad metaphor that literally everything is going to be remade, even the heavens themselves. But I don't know what Michael would say. So I'm not enough like Mike.
Lord Spirit, it says that on earth as it is in heaven.
Right. Sure.
Conversation that I think the chapter, I didn't read the Left Behind series, but I think it's all like people have this mindset that it's the kingdom of God is coming and it's in the future. But I think when we read Revelation in the Bible, I think it's best to see the kingdom of God is both a present reality and a future hope. And when we read and study, it affects how we live now and also gives us hope for what's ahead, whatever the trials may come. So being a present reality and it's a future hope. So it's not just something that happens in the future.
That's great. I love it. Yeah, Betty.
That's what number 4 is.
Hey, stop. Let's get it done.
What the soccer book's called the public worship and discipleship. That's the here and now. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the deep theme of discipleship. It's very important to the book. And to just kind of having a kind of loose familiarity of the other books that Corman has written. Discipleship is one of the central things that he is really concerned with. So I think that all of your comments were absolutely on point. Are there any comments from folks, our friends online? Yes, no, maybe? If you have a comment and you don't necessarily want to say it, you can also type it into the chat and I'll be happy to share that, okay? All right, so let me move us forward then. Let's move on to the next chapter. I've already completely destroyed my timeline. And there's no way of making it back up because, we're just having a conversation here, so I don't want to we have to get through all this. Next chapter, though, in the book, chapter 5, really is where he starts to kind of unpack. If he's really been kind of dressing up, kind of giving us, this is how I would approach it. Chapter 5 starts to give you a sense of what that would look like. I think it's important for us to remember that this is not a commentary in the traditional sense. So we're not going to get the deep kind of analysis of everything and have the picture fit together in every way. So there's going to be, I think, some shortcomings and some things that are just left unsaid. That chapter, though, chapter 5, it focuses on the first 3 chapters of the book. And I would say there's basically 2 things that he talks about in his chapter. One is about chapter 1 in the book of Revelation. And it really is about the vision of God and the Lamb that you see at the beginning, and I'll make a comment about that. And then the second is the one that most of the questions in the chapter at the end actually wrestle a little bit with, and that is the letters to the churches. So that's chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. So let me just make a brief comment. There is one thing in here that I think is really important to highlight, and that is that in the New Testament canon, Revelation really does give us one of the most explicit affirmations of Jesus. I guess we would say Jesus' divinity. But the way that he talks about it is this idea of divine identity. And I want to just quickly unpack this because it does have a technical history. And it basically is the idea that in the Hebrew Bible, God is God, and what makes God God is that God does certain things. That's part of God's identity. God creates, God judges, and God restores, and there might be one other thing. But these are the things that no other creature has the power to do unless God shares it with that creature, right? And so what we have in the book of Revelation is a pretty explicit merging of Jesus with God the Father, basically. That Jesus belongs to the divine identity. And he talks about how you see this very, very explicitly in chapter 1, where the Ancient of Days, or Yahweh, is named as Alpha and Omega, and Jesus is named as first and last, which is another way of saying Alpha and Omega. All these predicates that you would only attach to God are being attached to Jesus. There's no Trinitarian metaphysical working out of how that's possible. There's simply an affirmation that Jesus is clearly more than just a human being. And that what happened in Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection transcends what happens to any other human being because of the identity, because of what was happening. Because in a sense, what Revelation is saying is that God was there doing that. that was God's life also at stake. So he talks a little bit about that. He notes that the reason also for that first chapter, and I think if we think about what he said about some of the possible historical circumstances that led to the writing of this book, that there's a kind of message of hope and comfort being sent even to these churches, even the ones that are being rebuked. And he actually mentions, he says, one of the reasons that we see this vision at the beginning is to give us a sense of security that God has not abandoned us, give us a sense of hope, and call us into discipleship. So that prophetic pastoral part is really important. Then he shifts to chapters 2 and 3. He offers a critique of the dispensationalist approach. And basically the dispensationalist approach is dispensationalism and Left Behind are very closely related, but Left Behind is a type of dispensationalism. So just so that if you keep that in mind. So there can be other kinds of dispensationalism that aren't necessarily Left Behind type. And what they would do actually though, in that school of thought is that they would take each of these 7 letters and they would assign them to an age of the church. And so it was a way of mapping out history. And the question was, where were you? And you were always at chapter, you were always at the 7th church, because the church was always like about to be spewed out of the Lord's mouth. That's sort of the idea. No matter if you were writing the 19th century, the 20th, or probably the 21st. He then says, he kind of, obviously offers a critique. And then he gives us 2, I think, pretty helpful tables. There's a table on page 88 to 90. And then there's a second table, which is a little bit less unwieldy on page 98. That first table, he kind of breaks down, it offers a historical diagnosis of what are the actual historical things that we can link to some of these communities, like the Pergamon comment, right, about the seat of Satan probably refers to Zeus's temple. That's interesting stuff. That's particularly, I think, pertinent to to pages 88 to 90, that first table. The second table, though, he kind of, it's where he updates the message. And I think his big goal in the whole chapter is to say, it's probably better not to break down each of these 7, churches into ages of the church, but to say, actually, these offer a diagnosis of churches in different times and places. That you can find one of these kind of churches, we could find one of those 7 kinds of churches anywhere. And so the question, of course, is, what is our church? Right? Where are we exactly? Who are we? Where are we? What word might we need to hear? That really is sort of the way, the approach that he is pushing. Then the last thing is simply to remind us of, I think what for him are the 2 big challenges from the church's side, which is persecution or accommodation. Right? Those are the 2 things that he's trying to address. All right, so I want to invite you then to turn to page 101. And I am suggesting we'll take about 10 minutes to look at questions 2 through 4. So enjoy that, have fun with that, and then we'll come back and process that for a minute, and then move on to chapter 6.
Well, I'm in. I did it more.
What I identify or what are you saying that those are not qualities?
I think there's a couple of aspects.
But I understand.
I didn't interpret it that way.
Smyrna, Philadelphia. You have to pick what you want to be. Not the same, which one you are you? Which you have?
Temporary churches. That's
You said that you were after the church, like that, any other church in the United States or like Laodicea. Well, how is this like Laodicea? And then you get prideful, and then I like that. Or either hot or cold, or you're just kind of apathetic. It said it doesn't need that. The idea that it's just a peaceful. Hot water is good, cold water is good, and then the rest of those things with the back. There's lukewarm water. Laodicea actually is the visual water in the mountains and cool. By the time it's so it's like a specific water. The other churches, they had temple worship and idolatry. I just thought it was so specific. Christian, and they actually call this whole piece of it, like how persecuted Jews see they for what, you know, I'm here for that file, they call it for like a you know, it's like it is. I teach for art history class. You know what, we don't. Right. Yeah. And also. Yeah, yeah. just feel.
Yeah.
Doing good, Dave? Doing good, Dave?
Yeah, yeah. This is an excellent book.
Good.
Survey.
Two more minutes.
People might say they're Christian or aligned. They don't go to church. Well, a lot of times nowadays.
I think that's what we said, they're making.
Oh, and that's when it's bad. Well, there's more. In church, I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is like something great.
The life experience of God is different than ours. It's very much not much more personal. It's more, they've suffered more.
All right, I want to invite us back into large group. The questions I think I gave you were like take the grid and try to analyze your church, our church, other churches. Actually probably a salutary exercise to think about, like where are places where you experience these things. So what are some things you came up with? What are some things you talked about in your tables?
So we talked about, so I said in number 2, the cross, because there's so many people that wear a cross, just to wear a cross. The other thing, how about Christmas trees? They're everywhere, but is that a symbol of church? So that's a couple of things.
Yeah, the Christmas tree one feels more nebulous, but definitely the cross one, right? I mean, you see that almost everywhere.
United States flag.
Sure, yeah. Other, hold on, Judy.
I remember coming to church and the acolyte was walking down the aisle. And I looked at this lady who had tennis shoes on. And I was shocked. You don't wear tennis shoes to church. You dress up and you look nice. And I thought, whoa, I got that all wrong. I should be glad that he was willing to be an acolyte. And I was really into good clothes and good shoes at that point. And I had to shake to admit it, but yeah. So I thought that was kind of cool. So.
How do you feel about the issues of prom?
No, I think that's right. I think that's a great observation. That we, and it's certainly where I grew up, Sunday best, you know, that was what you had to put on, even though I was not much of a Christian. You know, so. Other comments over here?
No, we went right into the prosperity gospel.
Yeah, we're not.
Yes, you guys don't play.
And even mega churches would feel more like, how much money did we bring in and how many people do we have? Whatever happened to, we're there to worship God and we're working on a relationship with Jesus. Or with God through Jesus, where is that anymore? And Jeff and I agree, it's easier to talk about other churches than the others.
I have talk about other churches. Well, I just have some things I was pondering. I didn't get to share this in the group, but the church at Sardis from the book, he talks about, mentioned that the idea that they had undergone sneak attacks and they were asleep, maybe comatose. And, but then he says it's not apathy, but presumption. And I don't really know what he meant by that. So he had that thoughts, but it made me think of,
What page is that?
it is on page 94, 95.
Okay, go ahead. I'm just going to look it up.
Yeah, it's at the top of page 95. We should understand the state of slumber not as apathy, but as actively getting soiled through certain works, while clinging to a good reputation and assuming nothing is wrong. Thus, the main problem is not indifference, but presumption. And the need of those at Sardis is to identify and end the inappropriate activity. But later, when from my reading that the earlier page would come like a thief in the night, and this idea that they had in their history these sneak attacks. But I think it's interesting how there's the people that are woke and those that are asleep in the terminology with things today. And so this like idea of wake up and rise from the dead, I think is interesting. And
I do think, actually, I think the terminology of, you know, the woke awaken, that actually is coming out of Black church. So it comes out of this. Yeah, it comes out of this. Now, the ways that it gets, you know, refracted and experienced sometimes might be problematic, but I think it's rooted directly in this idea of like having the scales fall from your eye. I don't know for sure about the other apathy versus presumption, except that it seems that he's arguing that Sardis is probably participating in some kind of activities, i.e. they're accommodating in ways that they ought not. And that's the presumptive part as opposed to the apathetic they still have.
I thought it was their presumptive in the ideas that they're right about something.
Maybe, yeah.
Reminds me of certain churches today.
Anything from our table over here? You want to pass on this one? Okay. Oh, Yeah.
Just had a question here about, church Ephesus is kind of condemned because it abandoned initial love. Then 2 pages later, it says it's noted for its love. So can you explain, is this a time reference or?
I don't know. I have to pull up the actual passage here. What was the page again?
Well, in the
92.
chart, page 88. Down because of abandoned initial love. And then a couple pages later, when they talk about the church.
Yeah, the church at Ephesus finds the mark of the church to be love. which
Yes.
is Ephesus.
Church is part. I just,
Well, they abandoned their initial love, so that's what they're naming them, or they're not really up to their own reputation.
Yeah, I think the idea is. Yeah, he says that the story is often read as a rigid orthodoxy, right? That they lost the passion. They've maintained the form, but lost the passion. And his argument is that there's probably some truth to that, but it has maybe more to do with like the orthopraxy. But I guess I need to reread this to kind of more carefully pull out that. So I don't know if I have an answer for you. I certainly don't have time to do it to you. I apologize. Okay, let me turn us then to, just as we're moving again, if you need to go. I know we got some time coming up here, Judy, where you may have to split. Chapter 6 then continues this sort of engagement with the text from Gorman's perspective. And here he comes to Revelation chapter 4 and 5, which he argues really is the center of the whole of the book of Revelation. And I would tend to agree with that, particularly chapter 5. These are the scenes where John is taken up to see these scenes that are set in the throne room of heaven, and they are worship scenes. And there is one scene in chapter 4 of the Ancient of Days of God, and then that is followed by a second scene of the Lamb that was slain. So that's Jesus, obviously. And his argument, of course, is that these go together, and that they do a number of different things. The most important thing I think, to take away from his argument is that this is the center of the whole book, and therefore these 2 chapters, in a sense, give you the interpretive key by which to understand pretty much, anything else that's going on in the rest of the letter, or at least the big themes, that's for sure. Now, what does he mean by that? And I wish he was here. I would love to have him, maybe this is a question that I'll save to have him unpack that, because I think part of what he's trying to say is that in these scenes, we're not just sort of given a picture of God, we're given a picture that conveys to us characteristic marks of God. The first scene is, of course, overwhelming majesty, right, of the Lord of the universe. And the purpose, of course, there is in some sense to say that no matter how bad things are on earth, God still sits on the throne. And that majesty is a majesty that includes all. I mean, so these are also scenes with like the 4 beasts from across, so the 4 corners of the earth, effectively, right? All of creation in a sense is represented, 24 elders, et cetera, et cetera. The second scene, though, is the one that really radically transforms in some ways the first, and it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the book of Revelation in chapter 1, which is this idea that the Ancient of Days shares the throne with the Lamb that was slain. And there are a couple of things to take away from that, I think. Number one is it tells us something about God's character, God's willingness to share. And I was just, as I was thinking about how to even convey this, in a sense, God is humble. And humility is not simply a human trait, it is a divine trait. That's one thing to sit with that let that blow your brain out for a little bit. But the other one that I think is even more important, probably, especially for the argument as it's going to develop, particularly when we get into the drama of like chapters 8 to 20 or whatever, is the idea that the Lamb who is worthy to sit on the majestic throne of God is a slain lamb. The way that this lamb exercises the power that the throne stands for is precisely through the act of giving himself, that sense of self-giving. So I don't think a more profound counter picture to the ways of the world would be very difficult to imagine one, and especially the ways of empire, right? So you get this real, essentially counter narrative, counter vision, and also a sensibility about what we might be asked to be living into, right? The discipleship themes are not very far away. To me, this passage on page 103 is really important. And he basically is saying that it's at the very bottom of the page, and he says something to the effect that there's something amazing being conveyed here by this vision. There's two amazing things. The first, quote, the first is that God shares sovereignty and honor expressed in the receiving of worship with the Messiah Jesus. That's the first amazing thing. And the second one is that this Jesus who is worthy of worship has exercised his messianic office and power by being slaughtered, right? By that act of self-giving. And so I think now you start to you get where he is going to root theologically the argument for nonviolence. That the way of Jesus, the nonviolent way of Jesus, is actually with the grain of the universe. That's the grain of the universe, not the taking of life, the dehumanization, all the kind of things, the churnal that we hear about, in terms of empire. The last thing I think that's important here that he kind of reiterates is simply that these visions, one of the things that, obviously aside from the fact that he argues that they're important for the whole book, is that they really are they're not meant just to be the center of this text, but they're meant to center us, right? They become reminders. It's not just that God is on the throne, it's who is the God who's on the throne? And how is that God God? How does that God actualize what it means to be God? Well, he does so not through capricious power and violence, but through self-giving love, right? Through this idea of the lamb that was slain. So that is, I think, essential for his what he is particularly interested in. And this is why the worship component comes in, right? You can clearly hear the sort of theopolitical element there. You're not going to bend the knee, whether literally or figuratively, to anything else by committing your life, by walking in that way. But rather, you're going to live in this other direction. And worship, of course, is the expression of what's at the center of your life. This is one of the elements that he's picked up on, I think, before. All right, so I'd like to invite you for about 10 minutes to turn to page 115. And I was looking through the questions, and I thought, 1 through 4, so you can pick out the ones that you think are most interesting. So sometimes I go through, I'm like, there's no use. I don't bother with that. But these all seem to be interesting. So again, about 10 minutes or so, we'll come back in a few minutes.
And then the lamb, below it is the scroll with the seven seals, but you can make out that he's on a throne, and the arms of the throne.
And then
are just like a stone throne. That has, the symbols for the universe on it, twice blood, so it's grapes. And it has sovereignty, because he's not only got the holy halo, but it's got a pastoral one, rainbow pastoral one, which goes around. Yeah. That's a question. I totally love that.
So that's your art story.
But it's like what I've seen from that design. I went through all my books and art of the pictures. Sort of looks like that. I just think about it, people
Protecting the devil, that's what they would even say.
Dave, you got any questions? You haven't had any comments or questions, Eddie? You okay?
Oh, me? Yeah, well, I've got some comments. I can give you some comments. This is just a fascinating read, particularly chapters 4 and 5 for me.
When I come back in a large group, I'll take a second and get you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's all right? Okay.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. This is fascinating.
I find it interesting because the artist, they made it so that like you see the back. Then this meeting with the lamps and I think you can see the blood. All the pieces of things. You got a different color here? Oh, yeah. It just looked lighter. Now we see on the chest, there's the. And I think behind us, it was missing some of the gold. So that's the way I did. Also, no, I did.
2 more minutes.
What is it that we realize there isn't worship music, Christian music. There's just music that helps me think about God or something. I think we're gonna. I always wanted something more from my church experience. Well, what they did is that, well, that, does anyone have thoughts on number 4? Yeah. I just thought to hear.
Okay, so invite everybody back. Before we start, Dave,
Yeah.
online, you want to, I think you had some comments and wanted to make sure we incorporated you into our conversation here.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, a warning, I spent a year at the Bible College in Dubuque, Iowa, with the Plymouth Brethren, and they are the people that brought you dispensationalism, okay? J.N. Darby is their hero. I have the J.N. Darby Reference Bible, okay? And I don't, it was interesting to me. I grew up in the Evangelical Covenant Church. We never knew what dispensationalism was, but after marrying my wife, who'd been raised in the Plymouth Brethren, and then going down and spending a year at their Bible college, yes, dispensationalism and their look at Revelation is exactly what you're talking about, the 7 churches. In fact, I took the course down there from their lead theologian on, it's called Daniel Revelation. He puts those 2 books together when he discusses Revelation. And I just pulled out my notes and the comparison of Babylon and Rome and what the 7 churches mean. And I've heard more sermons on those 7 churches. That's the most popular sermon topic among Plymouth Brethren preachers, is let's talk about the 7 churches in Revelation. Anyway, this book has opened my eyes. I mean, it was just, this is the book I needed to read, because I always knew there's kind of another side, and I just hadn't gone looking for those books. And the fact that this book came up here, and I just popped open chapter 4 today, reading it this afternoon, and now getting into chapter 6. Wow. Suddenly now I see a whole new structure for looking at Revelation. And nothing against these people down at Emmaus Bible College. They're wonderful Christians, and I think they're all going to be in heaven. I really do. It's just that they have tied themselves to this dispensational explanation for these ages in Revelation. But this book is wow. But my father came out the same way. He was he took literally, I think it's on page 62, that little graph that he came up with, text or code. They all saw Revelation as text or code. And that's kind of the way I was raised. I never gave it a lot of thought. But now this book opens it up and says, no, there's just a lot more going on there. So yeah, I'm just fascinated here by what I'm reading, Christian. Just fascinated.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate it. I did not pay him to make that comment. I hope you'll be able to be here next week too, so you can kind of interact and ask questions with Michael as well. He'll be on Zoom. Mr. Gorman will be on Zoom, or Dr. Gorman. Dave, did you have another comment or question?
Well, I was just going to say, you did ask the question. I just want to start a food fight here, but at the end of the last chapter here, the question was, In your experience, what are the most prominent forms of cultural accommodation in the Christian churches today, talking about the 7 churches? And I guess the first thing that came to my mind, I may have misinterpreted the question, but is oftentimes it's this now attachment to political parties by certain Christians. And I think that I see that as a cultural accommodation, trying to get some kind of power by assigning or attaching yourself to a political party. I'm nervous about that. I don't like that. I think as Christians, we have a different mission in life, but I would see that as one of the cultural accommodations that Christian churches make today.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that comment. I was actually surprised it didn't come up, but maybe some of that will come up for this chapter. So we jumped in and we are now, I mean, you won't believe this, but we're actually not too bad on my timeline. I thought it was really bad. Okay, so chapters 4 and 5, and I gave you sort of the range of questions 1 through 4. So what were some things that came up at your table? So you guys passed last time. You can't pass this time. Got your 1 pass then. So. You can pass that. Any thoughts? Yeah, just things we talk about. It doesn't have to be earth-shattering.
I guess we spent some time on number 4, talking about how the music and the liturgy shapes us theologically, spiritually, blah, blah, blah. And I can remember songs I grew up singing and the doxology and some of those things that were so familiar. And then when I had times of trouble, times of doubt, and times when I felt far from God, I could bring that stuff up again and start singing it. And it just was a way to confirm to me and help build my foundation. So I think those things do shape you. So that was one thing we talked a little bit about.
All the music was familiar comes from there. And then this comment there is something that we secular power, culture. Focus on community variation.
Yeah, the
This was last point.
right, your last point, Dave, about the political associations and as a combination, she was saying that they resonated with that. I'm supposed to preach this next week. Well, I will be there, I promise. But I have a passage that talks about lying and the tongue and so I'm not excited necessarily about it, but I've been reading this text and then also reading in James and kind of comments on that. And it just, the political reality that we live in now, right?
Yeah.
Kind of post-truth world is constantly coming up as I'm reading this, and so it feels like, I mean, this book was written almost maybe over 10 years ago now, so it still, has a resonance. Were there some things that came up in y'all's table?
We talked about 2 things. One was question 1, reconfigure the identity so from power to humility. But the other thing is number 2, secular power in our culture. There really, Dale said there really isn't any secular power. Because,
Association.
yeah, the association, there's so many politics and how all that. I mean, if every politician would respond in love, then for people, then we wouldn't have such terrible government decisions, from my opinion.
And did you mean that in the sense that there's already so many associations of religion with government that there's
I
no.
think association is so surface. It's an easy spoken about thing, say it this way, but walk out front of the church, hold the Bible upside down and say, look, I want to be Christian. Well, no, that's, and that's, you know, what a lot of our politicians are doing and using. And, but it's not affecting the decision.
Yep. I'm gonna go over here before I open that can of worms all the way up. But it's true. I mean, there is a certain amount of prophetic.
I thought the most pertinent things that came out of our table were about music at the alternative worship, which we're now calling something else.
Bridge.
The bridge. So I want to do a rant about renaming things every 5 minutes, and I think, but I guess we don't have time for that because of what I. Yeah. So.
Noted.
But the idea that there can be music that is not explicitly religious music, but that can have a message that can be part of my worship experience. That was a new insight, and people should stand up and sing.
Sure.
And dance. And
Yeah, it's more
dance.
Yeah, we have a liturgical dance, or not a liturgical dance.
Since these chapters were talking about the Lamb and the throne, I, as an art history teacher, feel honored to be able to share my little insights on the iconography of your cover.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you noticed this, but the Lamb is slain. There's blood gushing out of his chest. And he's a calm lamb, you know, laying there. The Lamb has a halo, so we know he's holy. And the Lamb, and he's also got this rainbow mandorla, which is used for signs of divinity, but we don't know why the rainbow is in reverse. But note that the Lamb is on a throne, and you can make out the back of the throne and then the sides of the arms of the throne that are modeled after the stone thrones that were actually what the seat of the emperors would sit upon, the cathedra. It becomes our word cathedral. But on the sides of those, it has grapes that are the symbols for the Eucharist and the blood of the Lamb. The Lamb is also on a scroll with 7 seals. So, anyway, I give this a thumbs up on the cover.
Awesome, yeah, thanks for drawing attention to that. And I think if you're gonna save the question for him, that's where it's actually from.
Yeah,
Yeah.
reverse image search, we can't find it. I can just tell it's Byzantine and maybe early 6th century.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing what he answers to us. Okay, so time-wise, did you guys feel rushed at all?
No.
Does this feel like a good pacing? Was this okay? Was it too slow? Good pacing, okay, all right. All right, perfect. Well, our last chapter is probably one of the more accessible of all the chapters, certainly for tonight. He pitches out, you know, he kind of, like I said, I think it's actually a really great kind of teaching insight moment to stop what you're doing and kind of pause. And he makes this argument for plotting, you know, operating a plot, a drama, and it's a four-act plot. And then he talks about the main characters, right? I mean, that's basically the essence of the chapter. And I think it's again, a way of pausing for a minute. We've been getting into the material, you know, we've gone through the those first 3 chapters, now 4 and 5. And also we're getting ready to dive into some of the most, you know, difficult material. And so pausing in a sense offers that as an opportunity. So I don't really have anything major to say other than this is him again offering a kind of overarching vision. I think if I did have a question for him, it will be, you know, which of these overarching visions, I feel like you've given us like 4 or 5, which one do you think we should really adopt? Because he does have a penchant for doing that. I want to give you, I don't know, 5 to 7 minutes to turn to page 137. And I thought all these questions were actually pretty good. So you can pick out, whichever ones you're interested in. Number 1 is very interesting. Number 2, or excuse me, number 3 especially is very interesting. And we'll come back at the end and kind of conclude together. All right.
This has been so much that it's going here.
Funerals where the person dies outside the grave.
Yeah, so.
I can't see something like music. Every place you look, I see it.
They're definitely out there. I always liked good stand or enjoy the guilt. Catchphrase.
DC.
For goodness sake.
I think about it a lot. And I read it maybe 5 years ago or something. We did well since then. I'm not a saver. My master's class. I just remember thinking like we did not reading about when I just make your witness as a person alive, but also you realize like the more sin
Same number goes, whichever. You're welcome.
There's a lot there. Find the reader's digest.
Somehow, even though I wrote it about chapter 7, I stopped the other day at chapter 7, so I didn't. Yeah. Riley Mark passes.
2 more minutes.
Yeah, I was so long in that.
Okay, all right, so let's come back together for our final conversation. Thoughts on some of the questions at the end of chapter 7.
Well, we chose what I chose, number 4. Practical ways that we can develop a greater connection with those who are different than us, poor and persecuted. And my comment was, we could walk in their shoes, buy shoes. Purchase, buy, purchase.
Practical, like buying of shoes. Okay.
The 2 aspects, walking their shoes, and also provide.
Right. Right, so it's not just writing a check and getting rid of the problem kind of thing. It's like taking an active interest in what does it produce, this shoelessness? What does it produce? Yeah, I like that. Huh? Cool, why don't we have a list here?
I love how my table partner always volunteers. Okay, so we had community connections, volunteering, donate. Just become more aware, don't ignore it. Don't just say that I can't look at that, so I'll turn over this way. I think that those are some of the.
I looked at question number 1 and thought back to when I was in junior high school, when I was captain of the stage crew. And how am I considering Revelation as a drama? I started thinking of a play. And often when we go to a play or see a performance of something, it changes our paradigm, how we look at things. I also thought that it would also help us to see things in a different light. Good things, bad things, things we don't quite understand.
I really just, I see Betty in the comments too. I love that idea because you can go to the Guthrie or you can go to a high school play and you can experience something that you may not necessarily have all the kind of logical, but it's so immersive that it really does change the way that you see the world, the way that you're being shaped. I love that. That's great. Betty.
Going back to number 4, and I just think the missional theme of the church, the house church, and so many of the projects we've been involved in, starting with Renovation, and working with Freedom Works and the tiny house, and so we're immersed in working with, alongside, and kind of over there, and not just giving it, but being with the flowers, what's that preschool? And places like that. And then number 2, where do you see Babylon like again? The political stuff about Hitler at 125 about lying, and eventually the rhetoric becomes a blatant falsehood, but now people have not only come to believe the lie, they also live the lie. Over time, they have been narrated into it. This might be exaggeration, truth, falsehood becomes uncontested and uncontestable truth in it. And its effects highly dangerous. January 6th, and all the things.
I mean, that's what we can find that on some level we're seeing in the anatomy of that laid out in that event. Yeah. Thoughts over here?
We get one pass, right?
I sidetracked everybody again by asking, in the churches that you grew up in, was it a common thing to be preached about the devil and the terrible cosmic forces against us, or did you just hear the love of Jesus on the other side? Before I could jump into question 3, right? Most of us said no. And so I'm just wondering, as we dig deeper into the next part of Revelations, how
So
that's
most of us grew up in churches where we heard mostly about the bad stuff about Jesus.
no, we heard about the other stuff. And so, or the bad stuff in us that would get us, yeah. So I just think that may play into how we jump into the next part of this.
Yeah.
So.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. One of the things I was just looking at the table of contents and I was like, just kind of appreciating the fact that chapter 6 through 20 of Revelation is going to be dealt with in a single chapter. I was like, thank you. Thank you for that. Comments from our table of contents?
One of the things that just occurred to me is, you don't sound like this was your thing. Yeah, in the group with him and whatnot, we're talking about people are different, and how different can they be if the people on the corner holding up signs saying, God bless you, I'm starving, this type of thing. And the discussion came out about, do you give money or don't you give money, and whatnot. People talk about giving coupons, and how he made the point, he always keeps, I don't think he's driving now, he always keeps $5 tucked in the visor of his visor. He says, who am I to judge how they use it? I thought, wow. So who am I to judge how they use the money? So I've done it too, twice. I don't do it regularly, but I've done it. It's kind of interesting.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, we're a few minutes over, but not too bad. It's not blood, there's not too much blood on the floor. First of all, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the time you put in to read and your questions and curiosity, and you stuck with it even when you might have felt like, oh. You'll be happy to know our next meeting is in 3 weeks, so we have plenty of time. It's a shorter amount of material we'll be reading. And my intention is for the first hour, we'll talk about the material. Second hour, we'll have Dr. Gorman, who will be coming to us. I think he's out in Baltimore. So he'll be on Zoom. And hopefully we could just have a good conversation. There's no reason to feel at all intimidated. He's a normal human being who puts on his pants one leg at a time, kind of thing. So you should feel free to come in, asking your questions and things that provoke you or whatever. And I think you'll really appreciate that. Like I said, hearing him before, he's a very affable and accessible person. Two quick shout outs. Number one, if you haven't heard, we do a thing called Theology on Tap. This is once a month. We gather at a brewery for a couple of hours, basically. People are invited. We typically try to pick out the breweries where you can get both alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks. We will be at Bear Cave Brewery, which is in Hopkins, for our next meeting, which will be on the 18th of August. And this is an intergenerational thing, so folks who are elders and folks who are just out of college come. And the theology part literally is I write down some pretty straightforward, I hope generative questions. They're relatively like softball kind of things, and just talk about stuff that matters. So what is, like, one of the questions from our first time is, what is faith to you? So if that's at all of interest to you, I really encourage it. It's a way to get to know other people, folks both from our community and folks who are not from our community come. And so again, a good time to just be with other delightful human beings. And then the last thing is, if you really enjoy studying scripture in this way, I do teach a Monday morning Bible study, which will be starting back up in September. That will be on Monday mornings at 10 a.m. to 11:30. And I do kind of a theological, historical presentation. We're going to be doing the book of Acts. And I think we'll probably go through that for the whole of the year. So I'd love to see you, and I'll remind you again next time as well. So with that, let me just say a quick prayer, and we'll head on into the evening. Lord, thank you so much for your presence, for being here in our midst, for opening up our hearts and our minds, our ears, and help us to take away from this time together those things that matter, that you want to stick to us, and leave the other things behind. We pray also for our brothers and sisters who couldn't be here, that they know that they're on our hearts, and for those who have stepped out early. Thank you so much for this day and this community. In Jesus' name we pray. Hey Dave, great to see you, man.
Yeah, I think next time I'll come to the church. I think it's just easier for me to be in the room. I think it would be much more interesting. I hope they don't mind if I horn in on grab a chair in the back there somewhere.
No, please. I wanted this to be something where we have lots of folks from other communities coming. So
yeah. Well, I'll be right there at the location. And this fellow you have speaking, yeah, that's interesting. I want to hear him too and see how he got.
Great. All right, we'll see you then, my friend.